very special Blah Blah Comics, Blah Blah Curse Words presented by The Night Nerd. I'm Derek.
And I'm Colby.
And we talk comics sometimes, and occasionally we make those comics collide. Yes, it is our long-promised, often hinted at, delayed by like maybe almost a month, Comics Collision. Brian Michael Bendis versus Geoff, I don't know his middle name, Johns.
This one we've been teasing for a while, and normally we would have gotten to it, but both of these men have such a catalog of work, have so many similarities, have so many things to dig through, that this was one that I definitely did more research than I normally do on these, just because I'm familiar with both, but especially Bendis, I had a weak spot in.
I did too, because normally I don't do a ton of research. I tend to go off of memory and gut. I hate to admit it, but I did read some Geoff Johns Flash to kind of familiarize myself with Johns' early work, because I really didn't discover him as a writer until Teen Titans Infinite Crisis era. So I familiarized myself more with his older work. I was a Bendis booster for a really long time. Fell off the Bendis wagon for a really long time. For those of you who've been listening to Blah Blah for a while, especially since our inception, you have watched me ride the roller coaster of Brian Bendis fandom for a number of years now. Yeah. So I feel pretty familiar with Bendis's work. I did want to refresh myself on some Geoff Johns. It's that was why I initially, this one was one of my picks. I'll come out and say it right now. I did feel like this one would be a really good one because the creators, as Colby mentioned, are so incredibly evenly matched as far as both quantity of work and, honestly, overall quality of work.
Yeah.
They're both exceptional writers. They were both the creative spines of their respective companies for a number of years. They've both dabbled in work for their other companies, Bendis more recently and arguably more successfully than John's taking a stab over at Marvel. We'll probably touch on that. And also, I don't feel like occasionally when we do these collisions, we have kind of a dog in the fight. You know, we kind of feel like we are arguing our favorite versus the other person's favorite. And this one, I feel like we're both fairly, equal fans of both Bendis and Johns. We both really appreciate both of their works. If I had to, gun to head, Beatles versus Elvis, choose between Johns and Bendis, I would absolutely call myself a Bendis booster over a Johns fan. Colby, I really think that you would probably side with Johns ultimately, gun to your head.
Yeah.
I don't think either of us would be upset if the person that we kind of favor ends up losing this fight, because they are both incredibly quality creators.
They are, and I think both of them, to this day, one thing I appreciate about both of them is any time I've completely given up on one, they always seem to do something that makes me go, okay, well, I'm going to give this a shot.
You and me both, you do not see how hard I'm nodding my head right now, because I absolutely agree with that. There have been so many times that I have been like, fuck Bendis, I'm done, I'm tired of him, I'm tired of his stylistic tics, I'm tired of his writing. Oh, this Defender series is really good. Yeah,
I mean, Johns, I've been very similar to Johns for, even before Rebirth, where it's like, don't love his Justice League. I get why people love it. It's a different take, and then shit like Darkseid War happens. Like, oh well, this is fucking actually pretty cool.
Darkseid War is kind of fucking baller.
Yeah,
I have the omnibus, and I read that particular omnibus in 2 days, and I normally do not clear an omnibus that fast. But I was having a ball. I didn't want to put it down.
It is like by far possibly the biggest, like most Fast and Furious version of Darkseid ever. But much like a great Fast and Furious movie, it has that great heart to it still. We're like, man, this might be cosmic crazy action, but he's pulling it off, and he's adding some subtle elements that actually turned out to be big seeds for the future that a lot of people didn't give him credit for at the time even. And Bendis has done the same in the past with so many books. It's like, man, you kind of given up on him, and then he does something like, I know for a fact, his X-Men run you are a huge fan of because of stuff like that, where he planted seeds early on that people didn't catch, and later on he went full force with them.
Absolutely. Or I know you were not a fan of his initial Action Comics 1000 pages, but when Man of Steel rolled around, even you had to admit, dude knew his Superman.
Yeah, I didn't like again that. Well, I loved the Man of Steel miniseries. It was that the only thing I've hated from Bendis since going to DC was that stupid first story in Action 1000. I think that was just like
because that was a cause of argument between us. You did not like that, but then you felt pressure to pick up the Man of Steel issue 1, and you turned around on it. You got it. You fell in love.
I really did, and crap that even goes to put it in preference. Geoff Johns' DC Rebirth issue, where a lot of people, including us, were very skeptical of can they rewrite an entire company in one issue? Turns out, yes, he can.
Mm-hmm. Can you apologize to an entire readership for a well-intentioned but failed relaunch of your company, and make sure that people will stick around to go for the future? Yes. Yeah. Yes, you can. Holy shit. Can you believe it?
They've both pulled off some incredible upsets. They both have had series that I think we would put in a lot of characters' greatest runs ever. They've both been defined by working for one company or another, like you mentioned. They have both been here for a long time. They've both, at one point in time, they were both 100%. You said they were the spine of the company, and they truly were. They were the time period, especially from about like 2008 to 11, that both of them were basically so synonymous with their companies that they were 1A and 1B in the company no matter where they were.
Right, exactly. So let us pit them against each other and see who comes out on top. If anyone, I would like to remind everyone, we had our first tied collision last time, Greg Capullo versus Frank Quitely. Yeah. We just could not figure out which artist ultimately won our hearts more and won the hearts of the public more. Are we looking at another tie this time? Will we have a definitive upset? Who knows? I'm excited to find out. Colby, you wrote the questions, so, sir, I am turning it over to you.
Well, first one, we're going to start with the big one, but one that both these people are known for and something that we can compare pretty well. Who is better at long-term storytelling in comics? Because, goddamn, both these people have had some long-ass runs. I guess if you want to go, this is, in my head, this is a big, basically Spider-Man, Ultimate Spider-Man versus Green Lantern, although both have had long-ass runs in plenty of other series and great-ass runs in plenty of other series, too.
See, I've also got to put Bendis' Avengers on there, because between his disassembled storyline and the classic Avengers run into New Avengers, into the Heroic Age Avengers and New Avengers relaunch, that is all one continuous story. I mean, he said himself at the end of the run that if you include his crossovers like House of M and Secret Invasion, dude had written over 300 issues of Avengers comics, which, admittedly, he wrote a single continuing story for Ultimate Spider-Man for a couple hundred issues. I feel like his Avengers run tops even that. Oh, yeah. And then you've also got... You got to put Flash in on Geoff Johns' side, because he was just as definitive on the Flash. Well, maybe not just as definitive. I feel like by creating the cores that he did in Green Lantern, he's probably the most influential Green Lantern writer outside of, like, probably, Green Lantern's Hal Jordan Green Lantern's creators. Yeah.
Well, and that's the other thing. It's just interesting you mentioned Avengers, because we were just on Justice League. They both tackled so many characters for the respective companies of like their equal counterparts, and both have had defining runs and defining moments, and even like stuff like Bendis on Daredevil and shit like that, where you have to really take into account of that's the biggest issue in my head, is they have both had these moments. And the hard thing is, normally I could just be like, well, Geoff Johns brought back Hal Jordan because Geoff Johns brought back Barry successfully, but in fairness, you have Bendis, who created Miles Morales, who successfully introduced the Ultimate Universe of Spider-Man, who brought back Peter Parker to prominence, who arguably brought Daredevil back in prominence in a big way.
Well, you had the original Marvel Knights with Kevin Smith. That really put Daredevil on the map. What I feel like maintained and grew that map was Bendis. Mm-hmm. Daredevil was already doing as well as he'd ever done under Frank Miller, thanks to Kevin Smith, thanks to David Mack, to a lesser extent, the guy that wrote Back to the Future, whose name currently escapes me, who did like a 5-issue story. But Bendis' sustained run on Daredevil really won a lot of fans. Now, as much as it breaks my heart as a Bendis booster, what this really comes down to for me is, if you're going to write a long-running series, if you're going to stay on a title for that long and really create that much lore and story, I also feel like you have to be able to craft a satisfying conclusion to that long run of a story. And ultimately, I feel like Bendis comes out a bit the lesser here. As much as an amazing cliffhanger as Daredevil sitting in a prison cell for coming out as possibly having been Daredevil and running cases as Matt Murdock is as a cliffhanger, it's also a super shitty way to set up Ed Brubaker, who, to be fair, told a tremendous story with it and managed to do something with that setup. But it is kind of a shitty way to end a series. Yes, to be fair, Secret Wars completely yanked the rug out of Bendis' X-Men run. And as much as I like X-Men 600, I will absolutely admit that it is flawed, and I have no idea why Beast has the look on his face while he's driving away from the X-Mansion. His Avengers run ends on more or less a joke. The last 4 issues of his Avengers run, while it does bring back Janet Van Dyne and is a blast and is super fun, it's silly, and it's intentionally silly, and it's clearly just him having a good time saying goodbye to characters. Yeah. Whereas with Geoff Johns, all you got to do is look at his run on Green Lantern and his final arc on that with the, and as much as you got to admit, the last, especially with New 52, I know I'm rambling, man. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, it's totally fine.
As much as you can say when Green Lantern becomes New 52, it essentially becomes event. It really is just a series of explosions leading up to a spectacular finale with Wrath of the First Lantern and introducing Simon Baz. Geoff Johns brought a definitive ending to his Green Lantern story while still leaving it open for someone like Robert Venditti to come in a way that I feel like Bendis, again, as much as he's my preferred fighter here, I feel like he has a really hard time making that satisfying, definitive conclusion. He did it with Ultimate Spider-Man, but that's the only one that immediately comes to mind.
See, and this is more Marvel's creative that I do have a problem, because I will agree, after finally getting caught up in Ultimate Spider-Man, he definitely did, but then when it came to Miles Morales had a pretty good ending, and then he just kept going for a while, and arguably may have saved it a little bit at the very end, but for a good chunk of it, the last year of Miles Morales' Bendis life, that wasn't the best.
I would also argue, as much as he tried to have a definitive ending for his Iron Man run, it fails. It absolutely fails. And I don't want to feel like it's because he had an eye on the door, for DC while he was writing it. But for Iron Man 600 to be his very last final Marvel comic, it's a dud.
And, see, I will say, when especially come to the endings, Geoff Johns, for the most part, anytime he has ended a series, has left the door open and left more toys in the toy box than when he started. And
also gave you a satisfying conclusion for his take on these characters. I mean, if you want to go back to Darkseid War, that was his final definitive statement.
Yeah.
On the quote-unquote Justice League event. Now, did all of the Justice League events leading up to that more or less blow? Yeah, Trinity War was a fucking bomb. Forever Evil took 3 years to complete, even though it only took 9 months to complete. There was definitely some overall rough patches in his Justice League run, and even I have a couple of problems with Darkseid War overall. And we might talk about that later. If not, I'll tell you my joke later.
Yeah.
But still, Darkseid War being that final definitive, like I said, explosion, and I think that's what Geoff Johns does, is he figures out what that final third act climax explosion, what that sky beam, for lack of a better term, needs to be to end his run on a high note in a way that I feel like Bendis never really got the grip of. So if we are talking long-form storytelling, I feel like you have to talk about the ending of those long-form stories. And as close as these two gentlemen are in other ways and over the course of an arcing long-term story, I feel like John squeaks this one out just because Johns knows how to wrap up the goddamn thing.
Yeah, and I will also add, even though I do appreciate... I think Bendis might be best at the middles, but I would also say Johns is typically very good at starting off with a really good hook or a really good introduction too.
Yeah, and I think that's why people like John so much, is because his first issues tend to be really, really eye-catching.
Yeah.
If you want to go back to our very last podcast, the last one we did, our Great Returns to Comics, we both talked about a little bit about Green Lantern Rebirth and Flash Rebirth.
Yeah.
And the reason both of those books are so strong is they both have incredible, like you said, hooks for the first issue. So bringing back Barry Allen, bringing back Hal Jordan in clear-cut, story-important ways that feel both in continuity and fresh. It's exciting. Yeah. Now, if we're just talking beginnings, Avengers Breakout issue 1, the first issue of his New Avengers run, is fucking tremendous. I fucking adore that issue. The first issue of Ultimate Spider-Man is shockingly good at being character focused. His first issue of Daredevil is really, really impressive for how it. I feel like there hasn't been a person who's gotten so immediately into Matt Murdock's head since Bendis until Zdarsky on his first run, and that includes Mark Waid, who did a fucking tremendous Daredevil run himself that I really love.
Oh, yeah.
They both kick off their books really well, but Johns ends them. Johns knows how to end them.
Yeah, we may. As much of you brought up an incredible point I wasn't even thinking about in that fight, but that's true. It's like, when it comes to the endings, when you look at all of John's major runs, they all typically have an ending that people who like the run are normally like, people who even didn't love the run normally like the ending, where Bendis has a bit of a problem with the endings kind of either being too complete and not leaving the door open for the next person, or being so open-ended that they kind of
fizzle out.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. To say something nice about Bendis' endings, I will say I feel like his 10-issue Defenders run that was essentially an advertisement for the Netflix Defenders TV series was actually really good start to finish. Like, I feel like he told exactly the story he wanted to tell with those 4 characters and the main villain that they all ended up going up against. So I at least got to give him that. He told a complete 10-issue story that I really, really loved. But again, looking at the overall oeuvre, I've got to give this one to Johns.
Yeah, and something we haven't talked about that may come up again, though, is I think with Bendis the problem is he might have that issue of where he looks so far in the future at times that he gets excited for something that hasn't happened yet, and when he has so many series coming out at the same time, there are certain issues where you can tell his focus shifts from one current series to the other, and it might suffer a little because of that.
Or, like you said, he does get kind of future blind. He spends so much of his Heroic Age, I keep saying Heroes Reborn, Heroic Age Avengers, setting up Age of Ultron, that then doesn't pay off for literal years. Regardless of the quality of the Age of Ultron story, he spends so much time setting it up that it feels like, then when you jump over to the Hood and Red Hulk joining the Avengers and nothing comes of it, it does kind of feel like a what the fuck moment. Why did we spend all that? Or again, he spent a lot of time playing with Killraven and the Martians, and kind of made it feel like that was going to be a thing. And that just eventually just kind of ended up being, no, Bendis just really liked Killraven and the H.G. Wells Martians and wanted to play with them for a minute. But it was tied so closely to the introduction of the Age of Ultron stuff that it felt like maybe that was all going to kind of come together in something, and didn't. So yeah, I think Bendis suffers a little bit of I was going to say future blindness, but it's more like future excitement. Like, he knows where the story is going, and he cannot wait to tell you, to the point where he literally can't wait and starts telling you before he's ready.
Yeah, I think I'm with you on this. I think I kind of want to get to Johns on this one too because of that. Because I think that's part of Johns. Typically, if you put that all together, Johns is normally pretty focused on his, and we haven't even talked about other shit like his Superboy or Titans or stuff like that. That also
right. Which honestly, that's the big one for Johns. That's the big miss for me as far as the ending goes. Yeah. He had such an incredibly strong run on Titans. Then they did the 1 year later jump for Infinite Crisis, and I feel like he really lost the thread of Titans. So that's Johns' one big miss as far as the ending of an overarching story. But it's nowhere near the quantity of Bendis misses.
That's fair, and I think it's fair to give Johns this one because he has Johns has crafted a very known bibliography of works that typically start and end really well. They may not always, but they typically do. There's not a lot. I mean, it's funny because even in current stuff, like his current book Doomsday Clock, it's funny because First issue, like Rebirth set it up well. First issue's not bad, and then the next like 6 issues, boring as fuck. And now we're finally getting towards the end, and the ending's actually getting good. And it's this weird ability for him.
I haven't read past issues 6 or 7. Whatever's on DC Universe is what I've read.
Yeah.
But from the reviews I've heard, it sounds like as much as Johns is doing well on the ending, it's sounding like he's rushing in, and he may have mispaced himself on this one. I don't know that for sure. I haven't read it, but that is something that is a criticism I've heard, and a criticism I can believe because of the issues of Doomsday Clock that I did read. It
does make you kind of got caught up in some very weird moments, but so far, like 9 and 10, and I think 11 just came out that long ago, have been very, very fun and very good and got to the point. That's like maybe he was so worried about setting up the characters we know in the Watchmen world. But again, that kind of bleeds in this next question, because if John gets that one, you also mentioned Age of Ultron. These are two people known for events as well, and they both have done a ton of events. Now, the question is, who is better at handling events? Because this is a big one, because they both have some incredible hits and incredible misses. I mean, John's out the gate. You have shit like Sinestro Corp Wars. You mentioned Forever Evil earlier. We just mentioned Doomsday Clock. We mentioned Rebirth. We mentioned there's whether it be his Crisis, Blackest Night, Brightest Day. You can throw First Lantern up there. Like, he has handled so many events, and Bendis has too. We mentioned Age of Ultron.
We mentioned House of M. I think I may have mentioned Secret Invasion.
Yeah. Now here's the problem. My biggest problem with this is we mentioned it. I feel like Bendis. There are a lot of events he has that have a lot of hype behind them, but shit like Age of Ultron, House of M. And I know some people like House of M. This is probably not the portion for you.
House of M has grown on me. I hated it when it first came out.
Yeah.
Kind of like with Civil War, as the years have gone on, I feel like the years have been kind to House of M in a way that people did not predict.
Yeah, that's fair. My biggest two issues with Bendis and events, and this is hard, and this is where I'm stuck, is Age of Ultron and Civil War 2.
I almost want to take Civil War 2 off the table, because Civil War 2 was such a company-mandated event.
I agree, but if we're going to talk about Rebirth for Johns...
Okay. I hate you because that's incredibly fair. But yeah, Civil War 2 was definitely shat out in the nadir of Bendis' period. Bendis wasn't putting out any quality work at all at that point. Yeah. And on top of that, Civil War 2 was corporate mandated because they had the Civil War movie in theaters, and they wanted something to tie in with that. Yeah. Civil War 2 is a goddamn mess.
It is, and that's what I hate about it, because like, I again, Johns has been involved in a lot of. This is also kind of an unfair
Trinity
thing.
War.
Yeah, Trinity War, because
excuse me, I caught there. It's Trinity War. Trinity War was goddamn terrible.
Oh, I agree. And this is the issue for me, is there have been. I feel like Bendis has been involved in so many events, but I can't right off the top of my head. And I know it's not always the best way to vote for on these things. Off the top of my head, I think of way more bad taste left in my mouth by Bendis events.
And honestly, I feel like that's fair. But what makes it, fair or not, what feels unreasonable is that I feel like Marvel used Bendis as an event crutch for a long time.
That is the
because
problem.
every time they went to somebody who was not Bendis for an event, the event fizzled even worse. I mean, say what you will about Secret Invasion, Fear itself is a goddamn nightmare.
Yeah, no, I agree. Like, that is probably the most unfair thing, is there are so many corporate mandated events from Marvel that especially when Bendis became the guy that handled so many of them, or at least was a co-writer or involved in so many of them.
Right.
But what we're not giving credit for, we do it because we have to say, when he has something that really, really works, when it should, like, because you got stuff like Man of Steel was pitched as an event book.
Right.
Stuff like that.
Event Leviathan, which if it sticks the landing, I was telling you off mic, if Event Leviathan sticks the landing next week, I will put it up there as the most successful within its own continuity event. Actually, I said I said Sinestro Corps War earlier. I think I'm going to change my answer. I'm going to bump it up a little bit quicker. Nobody expected Spider Island to be as good as it was.
Yeah. Well, and actually, the first Spider-Man we could put up there.
Yes, yeah, which again shouldn't have worked, and even that one, the first issue was like, does he know what he's doing here? But by issue 5, it really captured a lot of hearts, and ended up being an incredibly tender, emotional piece about these two characters, these two people finding each other.
Yeah, and the only shit about bringing that up is then we have to bring up Spider-Man 2.
Exactly, which is a horror show.
Yeah. Which that's the unfair, and again, until I asked the question, I didn't think until you just brought up where that is kind of the unfair mark here. Is Bendis was entrusted with so many of the corporate events that it does suck. Because for every Spider-Man, you have a Spider-Man 2. For every Death of Spider-Man, you have stuff like House of M or Age of Ultron. And it does kind of suck because...
And then so many of John's events, if you want to point out the events, were, like I said, like Event Leviathan, like Spider Island. You had the Sinestro Corps War. You had Blackest Night, which, yes, had a bunch of tie-ins and shit, but was ultimately at its heart another Green Lantern story.
Yeah.
He did do Infinite Crisis, which was beautiful and fantastic, and actually... Honestly, I've reread it recently. Surprisingly deep into the continuity of what was going on. It actually did not age nearly as well as it feels like it should have. Brightest Day also completely kneecapped by New 52.
Yeah,
all the stuff that was supposed to grow out of Brightest Day got shot down. You've got Forever Evil, which again was just a goddamn slog of a nightmare of an event. You had Trinity War, which was like a 9-issue event book. That all it was to set up Forever Evil. Also, here's a character heel turn that makes literally no sense because we've actually seen this character stop Bubbles before, and she never at one point acted anything like this until now. It's hard because I feel like event books are hard, and I feel like... No, please go ahead.
Yeah, no, it is a hard one because, again, I think... For me personally, I think John's is better, but I also think so much of that is because I think it goes back to Bendis may have been too much of a company man at one point and bitten off more than he could chew when it came to those, because...
That was the word I was looking for, company man. Anytime they had an event, he volunteered, and if he didn't volunteer, the event inevitably kind of suffered as a result. I mean, as fun as Original Sin is terrible. Yeah. As great a writer as Jason Aaron is, Original Sin is terrible.
Yeah. Well, and then Bendis,
so they kept going back to Bendis.
Yeah, and Bendis was even involved in... But here's the other thing. So even if you don't go co-writer stuff, I'm trying to think outside the box a little, like, Bendis was a co-writer on AVX. Johns was a co-writer on 52.
Yeah, that's true. And, I hold 52 up as the shining beacon of everything that comics can be is perfect. So, yeah, I kind of want to give this one to Johns as well, but almost on a technicality.
I know. I do feel like this has an asterisk.
Because so many of Johns' events were Johns' events in the first place. So many of Johns' events are Green Lantern events or are Justice League events, and he's writing Justice League. Whereas Bendis, as you said, perfect word, company man. He sirred himself into fucking Civil War 2.
Yeah, I think not meaning to give two out to Johns out the gate, but I do think that's fair because you're right. I think he was such the company man for a while, and that will actually... I'll switch to this question so this will bleed in better. But I think that helped his career, but as far as when you're looking at events, it's definitely a hindrance because, you can't... Talking about events, you just can't avoid the fact that there was just a lot of mandated events that he was in charge of that almost always sunk up with movies and almost always...
Stunk.
Yeah. Like, there's no other way to put it, and that's what's just sad and stupid about it is the events that he was in charge of that were spinning out of his books were almost always hits. And if he didn't have that big asterisk of, again, stuff like Civil War II and other things, it would be...
And see, that's why I want to give it to Johns, but I want to give it to Johns with an asterisk. Yeah. I want to give it to Johns with a little notation on the side with a little footnote explaining exactly what this means and why this means what we're saying it means.
I feel like if Johns had one less Sinestro Corps War and Civil War and one or two of those didn't exist, if Civil War 2 and Spider-Man 2 didn't exist, this would be a much better fight on this one.
Yeah. I think that's a really fair call because even stuff like Age of Ultron have their moments.
Yeah.
In a way that Forever Evil occasionally has a moment. So.
Yeah. And so we'll do that. But that also leads into who was kind of going this talking about company men. who was more important and better for their company and kind of the best team player for their company?
See, that's a really interestingly phrased question because I feel like it's a neck and neck dead tie right until you say who is the best team player. Because I feel like if you're willing to take the bullet of Civil War II, you win that title, no contest.
And I think what people forget about, there was a long period where Bendis, not only was he known as the Marvel guy, he was kind of the only major named writer they had for a little while.
He was kind of the face.
Yeah,
he was kind of the face of creative for Marvel.
Because even if you think like the New 52, like you think of New 52 and a little bit after, when they started losing when Hickman first left, when Remender first left, and you had a period in time where you had Geoff Johns, Scott Snyder, Grant Morrison, all these huge names over at DC, and for a while they're the only
people
big names.
Building their names.
Yeah, people building their names. That's around the time you had Tinian start popping up. Yeah. You had him popping up. You had people like Becky Cloonan start popping. You had all these names that were building a name in doing cool DC projects. And Bendis was kind of the only big name they had, especially after Remender left, before Jason Aaron kind of got back to where.
Before Jason Aaron blew up, before Zdarsky came back, when Zdarsky was hip deep in Sex Criminals, and that was really all he was doing. Yeah, all you had was Bendis. Bendis carried that company on his goddamn creaking shoulders.
Yeah, so I will say for you, I think that's a good way to put it. If you're willing to take the bullet of Civil War II, the bullet of Age of Ultron, the bullet of Spider-Man 2, and all this stuff.
And the bullet, speaking of Spider-Man, the bullet of killing Peter Parker, because that was corporate mandated. That was not Bendis' choice. Bendis was told, and he has mentioned this in interviews, Bendis was told that Ultimate Spider-Man was going to die. Bendis could write it, or they could get somebody to write it. So the fact that the death of Spider-Man is as affecting and as memorable and has lasted as long as it has is because Bendis didn't want anybody to fuck with this story and told a story that he didn't necessarily want to tell because, again, company man. Yeah.
No, I think for this one I'm down giving to Bendis because even though Johns is known as the DC guy and the person, I think Bendis, when he was at Marvel and he was especially between 2005 and 2011, 2012 even, I think Bendis was so much the face of Marvel, and he got almost as much blame as its owners, operators, editors, because he was the Marvel guy. And I think if you're going to give somebody that much blame for making Marvel great or bad, that shows how much of the company and team player and spine of the company they really are.
Right. And admittedly, John's got some of that, but nowhere near as much as the Dio. I don't think John's ever necessarily took the flack he probably could have for the Green Lantern movie, which he helped co-write and produced and, had a pretty heavy hand in. And that is actually something, that's not one of your questions, but I kind of want to touch on it. You usually talk about pop culture impact, and that's not really something we do with these two creators. But if we were to kind of talk about it, Bendis sat in on the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movie. He gave some notes about that. He wrote the post-credit scene in Iron Man introducing Nick Fury, and he's written on a lot of the Spider-Man television series that have been around. Geoff Johns, for all of his being a creative director for DC, the thing you can most hang around his neck is the abject failure of the Ryan Reynolds Green Lantern film, which set the DC Universe films back nearly a decade.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of what when you think of what he was in outside, especially if you take out the animated works, was a key figure in the DCEU, and that's to this day kind of so. Because of the nature of that, it's like he's an executive producer on BVS and BVS and Suicide Squad. Yes, Wonder Woman, but also Justice League, Aquaman, Shazam, but also Birds of Prey, which who knows, and Wonder Woman 80. He's a writer on Wonder Woman 84. I did not know that.
Oh, I did not know that. That's that could bear well or poorly for Wonder Woman 84.
Yeah.
Again, who knows? Because his track record with cinema, or a track record outside of comics, I should say, is dicey in a way that I feel like Bendis's isn't. So while this isn't a real point because it's not an actual question, I also kind of wanted to tilt that in Bendis's favor as well, because I feel like he's made a lot of positive pop culture impact. And again, I kind of feel like you can say that in the way of Company Man, if you want to put it under that, because he absolutely did all of that for Marvel. And if you want to say, Company Man for DC, dude created Naomi right out of the gate.
Yeah, well, and I will. What it comes down to for me is...
you've got another question about that. I'll shut up. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, that's totally fine. What I was going to say, though, about all this is, for me, what it comes down to is there was a time period where if Bendis would have left Marvel... when Bendis did leave Marvel and he was at a career low, it still hurt them almost to a point where no one knew what he was going to do. Had he would have left at his peak, it would have been totally gone. Geoff Johns, however...
it would have destroyed Marvel.
Yeah.
It absolutely would have destroyed Marvel.
Geoff Johns, arguably, and he's had a long period of peak, so it's hard to argue. But even if Geoff Johns, no matter when you say what's his peak or when it is, Geoff Johns, DC again still had Morrison, Snyder, Azzarello, so many names that were around him that could have and would have taken that spot,
and obviously have.
Yeah.
I mean, let's be completely fucking honest here, and I'm saying this as someone who adores so much of Jason Aaron's work. I jizzed over so much of his Thor run. I am legit excited every time I read an old issue of his Ghost Rider. Bendis hasn't been replaced at Marvel yet.
Yeah.
He hasn't. He has not. Johns was replaced at DC as soon as Snyder got Batman.
Oh, yeah.
Let's be honest.
Johns, when Johns was able to step... Again, why I mentioned all those names, because DC has been very good for a very long time at having a top-tier talent rotating table that if someone needs to leave or someone does leave or someone moves to a different project, someone else can replace him, and it's something Marvel for 20 years, almost 30 years, hasn't quite figured out how to do, and that's why Bendis was so important. And there's no matter from New 52 to Rebirth, but pre-New 52 to, from 2005 to now, there's always been someone there that if Johns was to just up and leave, and when Johns did pretty much up and leave for the movies, and then when he even just writing Doomsday Clock now, again, DC's doing incredible stuff. And
they're fine.
Yeah.
DC's fine.
And, so I think Bendis definitely handles that one because Marvel without Bendis, still, like you said, it still hasn't recovered.
Yeah, and admittedly, when we said if Bendis had left at his peak, Marvel would have fallen. Marvel would have crumbled. Marvel's not crumbling, which shows that the people they do have are incredibly talented. I don't want to shit on Jonathan Hickman's X-Men. I don't want to shit on Donny Cates doing what he's doing with his cosmic stuff. But Donny Cates isn't Bendis yet. Jason Aaron is not Bendis yet. In a way that Snyder and Tynion, who's following his footsteps, have really stepped up and taken that, have been able to continue propping up DC continuously. Like you said, they've always had that strong bench, whereas Marvel really tends to focus on one guy, and the one guy they're focusing on, as good as Donny Cates is, he's not Bendis.
Well, I think it goes back in 2012 or 2013, when Hickman and Remender both left around the same time. I think those would have been the new guys.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. But Marvel fucked them over.
Marvel gave them corporate events that they hated. So we'll give Vince this one. And you mentioned earlier, but we'll go in the next question because definitely it's for these. I
would actually add Fraction to that list.
Oh yeah, Fraction.
Fraction, Remender, because Fraction didn't fear itself, and that's basically what killed Fraction's Marvel career. He was so goddamn stressed from fear itself.
You could even throw Gillen's name in that. I forgot about that time frame.
Oh Jesus Christ! You absolutely could. Yeah, because Gillen was, basically quietly redefining X-Men in a way that nobody was really touching.
Yeah,
and then Bendis kind of took it in his own direction. But I too forgot about Gillen doing some really quiet, interesting, fascinating stuff on X-Men.
Yeah, there was a time frame there, and then, like you said, it also proves it all came back to Bendis. Mm-hmm. But speaking of Bendis, the next question, something that both people are known for, and these next two questions kind of go back to back. So even if right now if Johns wins, we're still going to talk about it because I think they're worth talking about. But next question: who is best at creating new characters?
See, and you say that, and my immediate thought is, I've really got to give this one to Bendis because what Johns is known for revitalizing characters. Bendis gave us Miles Morales. Bendis gave us Riri Williams. Bendis gave us Naomi, who is already becoming such a tremendous and positive force in the DC universe. Johns brought back Hal Jordan. Johns brought back Barry Allen. Johns brought back Wally West in a way with DC Rebirth. Johns redefined so many great characters. He brought in Simon Baz, who I love. He brought in Jessica Cruz, who is a very interesting character and is also doing some really positive stuff.
Don't forget, fairness, Miss Martian.
Did he create Miss Martian?
I believe so. I'm pretty sure it was him and Tony Daniel.
Oh, wow.
Let me double check this really quick. But
I did not know, because I thought Miss Martian was like a character that he brought back.
First appearance, Teen Titans number 37, August 2006. Geoff Johns, Tony Daniel.
Son of a bitch. I did not know that. Still, if we're talking about what creators are known for versus what they've done, I feel like Johns is known as the guy you go to bring shit back. I feel like Bendis is the guy you go to for the new stuff, and he's so willing to do the new stuff.
That's true.
I mean, who goes to a brand new company like DC or Marvel, either one, and is like, here is a brand new character that I would like you to have all the rights and ownership to.
That's true.
I feel like this is my checkmate. Brian Bendis created Jessica Jones.
That's a good one. But you're forgetting LaFreeze.
Sorry.
You're forgetting Larfleeze, or however you say his name.
Larfleeze.
Yeah, Larfleeze. Which?
Well, if we're talking about characters that have had a pop culture impact, Miles Morales, Jessica Jones, you cannot stand up against that 1-2 punch. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean,
Spider-Verse and Jessica Jones being like the most beloved Netflix series, and having such an enormous and positive impact for women who had gone through some form of abuse, and having a character they could relate to that was a strong, intelligent, beautiful, powerful woman that they rallied around and adored. You cannot stand up against Jessica Jones and Miles Morales, man. I'm sorry, you can't.
That is fair. And again, I will say again, just thinking of like
that was a good jab of Ms. Marvel or Ms. Martian, though. I forgot. I had no idea that Johns created Ms. Martian, who is delightful and needs a bigger presence, but Into the Spider-Verse really does shut down your entire argument.
You're forgetting Pandora.
As did every other comic reader since DC Rebirth issue 1.
That's very fair. I think as much as I want this to be a closer fight, I think Jessica Jones and Miles Morales' current state definitely elevate. Because I do think Geoff Johns has created a lot of characters that, again, like Miss Martian, Jessica Cruz, Simon Baz, maybe in 5 to 10 years, or if the right project or movie happens, could be to that level. They're not now.
I feel like Jessica Cruz. I mean, she got her Fatal 5 animated movie, which was a delight. Yeah, I feel like both Simon Baz and Jessica Cruz have a genuine chance. Like you said, 5 to 10 years from now, they could be the next. Why am I blanking on Jon Stewart?
Yeah,
I mean, they could really be the new face of the Green Lanterns for so many of the younger generation. But if we're talking right now, here at this pop culture zeitgeist moment, Miles Morales and Jessica Jones fucking knock it out.
Yeah, and I think that's very good Bendis. And going into the next question straight off, because it goes right into that, and we were just talking about it, but it's fair because for a long time there have been about 3 names that when you think of revitalizing characters, the 3 that come to mind is Morrison, Johns, and Bendis for a lot of people. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's only fair to have, I think that's a Bendis point. I agree because I can't. When you talk about Jessica and Miles, but who is better at revitalizing and recreating characters? Because that is going to be, I think, a harder fight. Just for the fact you can't take away Bendis really bringing Peter Parker back to a place where it was for a new generation. Peter Parker was Peter Parker again.
How important those first few issues of Ultimate Spider-Man were, because this was pre-Straczynski Spider-Man, this was pre-Tobey Maguire on Spider-Man, this was when Spider-Man was a fucking joke of a character. Nobody cared about Spider-Man. He'd had an extended run from Howard Mackie. They killed quote-unquote Mary Jane to avoid the divorce. Just a mess. It was a genuinely, Spider-Man was, you can't imagine Spider-Man being considered a C or D-list character, but nobody was reading the book. Nobody cared about the character. And in comes Brian Michael Bendis on Ultimate Spider-Man reminding you why this character is cool and important and has this just an incredibly emotional core to this teenager. Reminds you why Aunt May and Uncle Ben are who they are, why Uncle Ben's death means something, why it's important, who Mary Jane is, why Mary Jane means so much to Peter Parker. Those first 13 issues of Ultimate Spider-Man are honestly very close to perfect comics.
Yeah.
And you got to put that up against Green Lantern Rebirth, which, again, as I said on our very last podcast, the last one we recorded, is pretty much the template for how to bring a character back. And
yeah, it's true. And you have from Green Lantern Rebirth, Flash Rebirth. We talked about just Rebirth for DC Comics, basically. You have even stuff like a lot of the 52 stuff, revitalizing so many characters in that way, or. And not only Green Lantern, when we say Green Lantern Rebirth, but reading through his run, like revitalizing the Green Lantern mythos and universe of characters to a point where, and this goes back to this goes into creating characters too, but the amount, what he did for, whether it be the different Lantern Corps, all that, and I think Bendis, I mean, even right now, you could argue what he's done for Superman is almost, in a big way, is helping revitalize Superman, because Superman was in a weird place for quite a while. The New 52 never quite knew what to do with Superman, and DCU never quite knew what to do with him. And
then they tried to, kind of retcon all of that and tried to be like, no, never mind, that didn't happen. Here's the Superman you loved from the 2000s. And that was all weird and confusing. And, some of that stuff worked. I mean, the Patrick Gleason... who's the guy that always works with Patrick Gleason? Peter Tomasi stuff was, pretty well loved by a lot of fans, our producer Lance included.
Yeah.
But it wasn't until Bendis basically just came in with a big old broom and was like, "Nope, here's Superman," and everyone read it. And I was like, "Oh yeah, that's Superman. Holy shit! Right? Yeah. Okay, right." Basically what Johns did with Green Lantern with Hal Jordan for sure.
Yeah. And I hate to put it this way, even though I know. I'm not the biggest fan of this run, but what Justice League Origin did for Justice League in bringing back the Justice League as, hey, this is the important team book.
Unfortunately, right after issue 6, it completely fell off, though.
I do agree.
Yeah, that initial 6 issues is a great holy shit moment, and kind of starts to harken back to the Grant Morrison JLA days.
Yeah.
But then it kind of completely falls apart until Brian Hitch does his little 10-issue series, and you're like, oh yeah.
Well, I mean, Darkseid War and stuff in there too.
Right, the thing is, I keep leaning towards Johns, and then you'll say something, and I'll be like, "Oh yeah, but Bendis totally did do this."
Yeah,
this isn't close. I thought, because I was initially willing to concede this one's to Johns, but man, you're putting up a better fight for Bendis than I am on this one.
Yeah, I think the only thing for me that is hard to is I think Johns has done it in such quantity, and I think it goes back to. For me,
quality of quantity.
Yeah,
as well.
For me, the big one is the Rebirth issue. Just, I feel like some people forget what the state DC was in literally before that issue,
right?
And what that issue did for DC Comics, and seeing the change in fandom and change in tone, going from super negative, super positive, literally over a nightly,
almost
release.
180 degrees, and literally overnight.
Yeah, I mean, I will remember that issue of you and Lance at the midnight release talking about it. Me having to rush to the store the next day to pick it up and read it, and just being amazed at the heart, at the level. Fuck, we haven't mentioned Aquaman, what he did for Aquaman.
Oh, true, yeah. That's honestly true.
Well, literally taking a character that was one of the biggest joke characters, including to myself, and then reading his run made me a fan of the character and be like, oh my god.
Which has made me gone back and read other Aquaman. Like, I'm reading through Peter David's Aquaman right now. I'm like, oh shit, I missed out on some really great comics because I was trained as a child to not like this character.
Yeah, exactly. And like, he somehow, I mean, again, Aquaman's an interesting one too, because I would argue like the first 3 volumes of his Aquaman stuff is fucking amazing. I loved it.
Yeah. And that Ivan Rice art is just chef's kiss, which we haven't talked about any of the artists these guys worked with. But again, because it's not like there's not a ticking point there.
Yeah.
Because with Geoff Johns, you've got like Jim Lee and Ivan Rice and Carlos Pacheco.
Yeah.
And that guy we're not going to talk about because he's an asshole who drew Rebirth.
Yeah.
But with with Bendis, you've got Michael Gaydos and Michael Lark and Ivan Reis, oddly enough, on his Superman stuff.
Yeah.
And Chris Bacallo. And, I mean, they've both worked with such a murderer's row of artists, you can't even really include that in the equation of what we're trying to talk about.
Yeah, exactly.
Because they're both fucking phenomenal and they have great taste in art.
Well, we haven't talked about, but also one thing Geoff Johns did do that we haven't mentioned is for some characters like Stargirl and Superboy and a lot of Titans, and also for some villains like Monitor and Anti-Monitor, whether you like what he did or not, bringing them back to a place of prominence in the DC that they hadn't been in for a while.
Right. But, I mean, I feel like you could argue that with Bendis as well, between what he did with the Purple Man, for example.
That's true. Purple Man stuff is...
Had the Purple Man ever been anything but a ridiculous joke until Alias?
That's true. That's totally fair, too. And I think
he did with Bullseye, an already, beloved character, with quite possibly his definitive Bullseye appearance in Daredevil number 49. Definitive for me, anyway.
Yeah.
I mean, if we're talking about bringing villains up to astonishment,
well, even
they're neck and neck.
Well, they are, but then because we got to talk about going back to the Green Lantern stuff, what he did for Sinestro and making Sinestro back to truly an A-list villain, and then flipping him back over to being a Green Lantern and flipping the script on that. Like, I think for me, I'm even though I do think it's closer than originally I thought it might be, I do think I still go with Johns just for the fact of how many times he's been able to revitalize a character, and even in the same universe or in his same run, been able to take a look at a character. I mean, crap, even shit like Superman Brainiac, and like bringing Brainiac to a point where a lot of people thought that he going back to a kind of a character that had at one point kind of become a joke, just weird little character. And having to book that for a lot of people.
To be fair, Joe Kelly did a lot of stuff with Brainiac during his run.
That's fair.
That I think set up what Johns was doing, but that doesn't take away from your overarching point. I'm forced to agree with you that I think Johns ultimately takes this point, but I do want to say I feel like he takes it in a squeaker in a way that I initially did not expect him to until we started talking about it a little bit deeper.
No, I agree. I think it's closer, and I think... it goes back to that famous meeting where DC literally talked, about Geoff Johns and Grant Morrison being their revitalization team, and just being like, hey, these two are going to be the ones to do it. So it kind of goes back to the reverse of what we were talking with Bendis, where for a long time that was what DC asked of Johns to, hey, can you make this person relevant again? And again, I will say, one we're not talking about enough is bringing back Barry Allen and Barry Allen's prominence in the world today. Is very important because Barry Allen now has arguably the most successful superhero show of all time, and we still may have a movie in the works. Who the fuck knows on that one? But still, having a show that, again, has become such a cultural phenomenon in the comics world and continues to be a character focused on that. And also, I mean, doing the same for Wally West years later.
Or years earlier.
Well, no, I'm talking with Rebirth.
Oh, okay. So, yeah, he did Wally, because he's done Wally West in both directions.
That's true. That's very true. Again, going back, I think that goes back to why I give it to him is because he's literally talking about Wally West, someone who he has been able to take both directions, or Green Lantern, again, somehow making Hal Jordan Parallax to the Spectre back into a Green Lantern and making it work in a believable way that wasn't just some cheesy comics explanation will never be unamazing.
Right. That's true. So, honestly, that's 5 questions, and 3-2, we actually have a winner. Geoff Johns takes it. But before we do our Geoff Johns victory lap, there was one thing I kind of kept mentioning off mic to you, and I feel like it's something I want to just kind of talk about a little bit right now. Geoff Johns may be the winner, but I do want to point out if we were to ask the question of not necessarily legacy, but comebacks.
Yeah.
It does. It feels like with the strain of Doomsday Clock, the lateness of it, the fact that he's really not putting anything else out, even with the relative masterpiece that is the DC Universe Rebirth one-shot, we do feel like we're possibly in the twilight of Geoff Johns' career, and I think he is basically moving on from comics after Doomsday Clock is done. I think he's once again going to be concentrating more on the non-comic side of DC, whereas the move to DC from Marvel has inarguably revitalized Brian Bendis as a creator. All but exactly one issue of the comics he's put out from DC, for me, have been varying levels of spectacular, and we're definitely in the middle of a Bendisance as a creator, as a creative force, and as somebody clearly having a ball doing what he's doing. I think between nearly dying and changing companies, he's found a new lease on his creativity and is more than happy to share it with the world. Yeah. So while Johns may have won this battle, Bendis is, winning the current marketplace.
Oh, I agree. I think
I love what he's doing.
I agree. I think as much as I think Doomsday Clock could still stick the landing, I also agree that the future for Geoff Johns is so unknown right now that it's very hard to know, because like I said, it's kind of unclear if he's hinted at, like you said, not focused on comics for a while. And a lot of the projects that he seemed to be attached to have gone to other people, whether it be Legion going back to Bendis in a big way, whether it be
JSA getting taken over by Tynan and Snyder.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that is very curious, but also if Johns has proved anything, it's like he's good at surprising and making it. Yeah. Like we're saying that now. For all we know, he could be writing the best like Batman or Justice League run ever this time next year.
That's true. That is 100% true.
Or we could be fucking ranting and raving about like the Catman solo series he's going incredible at.
Right, exactly. Because again, if nothing else, we've proven that dude knows how to dust off a cool concept and make it shine.
He really does. They're both incredible, and they are both in such a cool place that the one worrisome thing, and I don't mean in this on a dark note, like it is sad thing of like right now that DC is almost hoarding so many of these great talents. Mm-hmm. That can we talk about Marvel? Like Marvel, you do have some incredible talents there, but as far as these big top tier names, like we live in a weird time where technically you have Brian Bendis, Geoff Johns, Scott Snyder, James Tynion, Grant Morrison, Jody Howe. Like there's so many names. Becky Cloonan, Gerard Way.
Let me put it this way. My Marvel guy, the guy writing my favorite comic being put out right now, Al Ewing, is finally getting his Marvel event in December, and I couldn't give a shit.
Yeah, it's
I could not fucking care, because it's such a boring, shitty, ill-placed, because it was seeded throughout the stupid, shitty, unnecessary Marvel Comics 1000. Yeah. I don't care. I don't give a shit, and I don't think there's a single thing Marvel could do to make me give a shit. And that's with Al Ewing, my comics writer. Al Ewing is where Brian K. Vaughan and Tom King were for me a couple of years ago. Al Ewing is my guy, and I could not give a shit about his first Marvel event, and that kind of breaks my heart.
Can DC make a plea to get Al Ewing maybe to come over and write like Justice League or something when Snyder leaves?
Honestly, I'd rather see Al Ewing do Legion of Superheroes. As much as I'm excited for Bendis, if Al Ewing were to take over Legion of Superheroes, I would have a nerdgasm so hard I might lose the lower half of my body.
Can we get Al Ewing over to write that, and can we get Donny Cates come over to write some Constantine, and we can all be happy for a while?
And we'll just all be happy, yeah. Then all I have to buy from Marvel is all the goddamn X-Men books.
Yeah,
I'm going to do.
I'm okay with Marvel just being an X-Men company. I prefer that, honestly. But yeah, Bendis, Geoff Johns, we just talked about him.
Congratulations, Geoff Johns. Yeah. Undisputed champion over Brian Bendis. It was a hell of a fight. Bendis put up a hell of a fight. Yeah. Like I said, there was even stuff that you pointed out that I hadn't really thought of. So I'm so glad that these two Titans got, I feel like, the respect and coverage that they deserve. I
think so, and I think there's so much more exciting stuff to come from both of them in the future. We'll wait and see. But I think they're both proving that they're part of projects that could be very, very defining and very cool. Because I will say, the one thing about that will appeal to you more so is I will say it looks more like Geoff Johns is writing on Wonder Woman 84, but Deborah and Zack Snyder are no longer writing on the film, so it looks like he may replace them. So for you, that might be a...
That could end up being a tremendous benefit, yeah.
Yeah.
But of course, our opinion means nothing if you don't tell us what you think. We want to know what you think about the battle. We want to know what you think about what we thought. We want to know what you think about who won, who lost, who should have won, who should have lost. Please, please, please hit us up on any of the places you can do that at. You can post here on YouTube or on SoundCloud, wherever you're listening to this. We read all those comments. We try to respond when we can. Shoot us an email if you've got a longer missive. You can send it to blahblahpodcast@gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook, facebook.com/blahblahpodcast. You can find us on Twitter, where I am at blahblahpod.
I'm at Hellhound F5.
And you find us on Instagram, where I almost never post, again, at Blah Blah Podcast or at Hellhound F5. Thank you so much for listening. This has been a tremendous battle. I already have a potential idea for our next collision. It depends, because it's some slightly older creators Colby may not be comfortable doing it with. I'm going to ask him about it as soon as the mics go off. And if not, we'll have something like this soon. Yes. We love doing collisions. And by the way, we want to know who you want us to collide. In fact, we were talking, our next collision may end up being some mini collisions. We've done that before, where you give us two topics. We spend 10-15 minutes arguing, see if we can come up with a winner, and then move on to the next one. So if you have any ideas for some mini collisions, hit us up on any one of those places I just told you, and we will absolutely collide your ideas before we do our next big collision.
Yes, so thank you guys so much for listening, for being here tonight. Send in your emails, send in your messages. We promise we will get to them. But until then, thank you guys so much, and we will see you soon.
Have a good night.
Bye.